Saint Sava the Sanctified was born in Caesarea, Cappadocia in the small village of Monastic in the year 439 AD to righteous and God-fearing parents. The father of Sava, who was named John, was a military commander, and therefore he had often to journey to Alexandria on military matters. At the age of 5, Sava was left behind in Caesarea by his parents John and Sophia, as John had been ordered to travel to Alexandria. And so his parents entrusted him to his aunt Eremia, and they left much of their wealth in the hands of Sava. However, Sava's aunt had a handmaid who was ill-tempered and who upset Sava greatly. Thus Sava decided to leave Eremia's house and to live instead with his uncle Gregory. This caused a great dispute between the two relatives of Sava, not because either of them cared for the child, but rather they desired to have access to the great wealth his parents had left for him before they departed for Alexandria. And the blessed child, having the wisdom of an old man and seeing the quarreling and the contempt between his two relatives, renounced all the wealth of his parents and went to the monastery of St. Flavian II of Antioch, which was far from his native village of Monasticism. And so at the young age of 8 he entered the monastic life, and later on, at the age of 17, he was tonsured as a monk. And living there, he quickly learned the Psalter by heart and the other holy scriptures, and his love for God grew fervently throughout the years. Not long after, the relatives of Blessed Sava were reconciled, and so they came to him at the monastery and began to try to convince him to leave the monastery and to get married instead, so that he could enjoy his inheritance with his bride. And Sava, preferring to be forsaken in the house of God than to live in the dwellings of sinners, and loving the monastic life more than that of the laity, he did not listen to his relatives and their deceptive counsel, and he rejected them, saying, "I flee like a dragon from those who command me to forsake the way of God, because I am afraid that, with their evil words, they will ruin my good habits and then bring upon me the curse with which the prophet cursed those who are perverse in nature, saying, 'Those who turn aside from your commandments are accursed.'" So, having defeated this temptation which was brought on by the serpent, who through wealth and marriage wanted to take Sava out of his holy place, as he had also done to his forefathers Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and so another tempter approached to try to stray Sava from God's will, and this was none other than the devil of gluttony. For the blessed Sava, once working in the garden of the monastery, saw a very beautiful apple growing in a tree, and having been overcome by his thoughts, he took the apple from the tree, and he desired to eat it before the designated mealtime, which was blessed by the abbot. But remembering that in heaven, with such a fruit, the serpent brought the first man into sin, he stopped himself from eating it, and he proceeded to condemn himself, saying, "The fruit that killed Adam was beautiful and good to eat." And throwing the apple to the ground, he trampled down upon it with his feet, trampling together with it the temptations of the evil one. And even more vigorously he crushed the head of the serpent of gluttony, as he then made a vow to himself to never eat apples again until his death. From then on, he overcame all his bodily desires and passions through his great restraint, by eating and sleeping very little, and by always working, for his hands were always stretched out either in prayer or for work. Sava might have been very young, but quickly his good works and ascetical labors were comparable to those of the elders at the monastery. It once happened that a father of the monastery, whose obedience was to be the monastery's baker, got his clothes wet in the rain. And because it was winter time and the sun was not out, he had nowhere to dry his clothes. So he decided to put them to dry in the bread oven on top of the wood that sat inside it. However, as the time passed, he forgot about them. After a while, the brothers gathered to bake the bread, and they lit the wood in the oven, not knowing that the baker had put his clothes in to dry. And once the wood had been already set ablaze, the father remembered that he left his clothes inside, and he became very sad. There also present was blessed Sava, who, seeing his brother's sorrow, did not fear anything, and having signed himself with the Holy Cross, he entered the flame of the furnace without any hesitation or second thoughts. Just as the youths did not burn in the furnace of Babylon on account of their great faith, so too did the child Sava, on account of his love for his brother, come out of the furnace unharmed, holding in his hands the clothes of the baker, which remarkably were not damaged at all. And having seen this miracle, the brothers were frightened and said to one another, "What will this child be in the years to come, if he has already been made worthy by God with a gift like this, even from his youth?" And Sava spent 10 years in that monastery, growing in both wisdom and faith. After the 10 years, he decided that he wanted to go to Jerusalem to venerate the Holy Land and to search for the elders who were present in that area and in the surrounding wilderness, so that he could benefit from their wisdom and so that he could find there a secluded place to practice his ascetical labors. Therefore, Sava approached his abbot to ask permission to be released from the monastery by him, with a prayer and with his blessing, so that he could leave for the Holy Land. However, the abbot did not want him to leave, and he said, "It is not good, when you are young, to wander aimlessly, but it is more useful for you to stay in one place." But God, who ordains all things for one's own benefit, commanded the abbot in a dream not to stop Sava from leaving. "Let him go," he said, "to serve me in the wilderness." And the abbot immediately called Sava to him, and he blessed him and read upon him the prayer for him to be released. And Sava, being guided by the right hand of the Most High, came to Jerusalem in the 18th year of his life. And there he went to the monastery of Saint Ephthemios the Great. However, Saint Ephthemios sent him instead to Abba Theoctetus' monastery. It was here that Sava continued in his ascetical efforts until he reached the age of 30. Later on, Sava would realize that he had a distant relative who also belonged to the monastery by the name of John. And one day, John learned that his parents had fallen asleep in the Lord, and therefore he wished to go to Alexandria to receive the great inheritance his parents left behind. And John, being encouraged cunningly by the devil, proceeded to plead with Abba Theoctistu to allow him and Sava to go to Alexandria and to collect his inheritance. After much persistence, Abba Theoctistu reluctantly gave his blessing for the two to journey to Alexandria. When they arrived there, they ran into none other than the parents of Sava, John and Sophia. And Sava's parents began to weep for joy, for they had been reunited with Sava for the first time since they departed for Alexandria when he was but a child. And his parents proceeded to beg him to leave the monastic life and to get married and live together with them in opulence. However, Sava realized that this was another temptation from the evil one, and so he vehemently refused their pleas. Because he renounced their parental love and he ignored their begging and their many tears, he became hardened like a diamond and steadfast in his good judgment. And so he answered his parents' request by saying, "I am afraid of him who said, 'He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me.' So how can I honor you in your vain lifestyle more than God, more than the cross? And are your worldly hosts stronger in nature than the spiritual hosts? For if even the earthly kings condemn the soldiers who flee from their company to torments, how much more will the heavenly King not spare those who have joined his far more honored army, and then have chosen to fall from his chosen ranks?" And the blessed Sava also added this, "If you pressure me any longer to do this, to renounce the splendor of the army of Christ, I will not call you my parents any longer." John and Sophia, seeing their son's heart unyielding to their desire, ceased to upset him, and with great lamentation they set him free against their own will. Then they asked him to take some of their wealth for his own needs, after which they gave him 40 gold pieces. However, he did not want to take anything, but so as not to upset his parents any more, he took only 3 gold pieces. He later gave those pieces of gold to Abba Theoctistu when he returned to the monastery. Once Abba Theoctistu fell asleep in the Lord, Sava asked the new abbot for permission to retreat further into the wilderness on his own. And Saint Euthemius the Great, having heard of Sava's fervent love for God and about his desire to retreat on his own into the wilderness, wrote to the abbot saying, "Do not stop Sava from laboring in the manner he sees fit." And so Sava lived on his own in the wilderness 5 days out of the week, and on Saturday he would return to the monastery to attend the services and to eat with his brethren. After some time, Sava received the blessing to live permanently on his own throughout the entire week. Saint Euthemius the Great took much interest in Sava, and he constantly sought to guide the young monk in the monastic life and to help him grow in his virtues. Every year on the 14th of January, the Apodosis of Theophany, Saint Euthemius and Blessed Sava would go into the wilderness together to fast and to pray until Palm Sunday arrived. One time, Saint Euthemius wanted to test Sava's asceticism, and therefore he took him to an area that was barren and without any trace of water. And after much time, Sava collapsed to the ground on account of his exhaustion and thirst. And so Saint Euthemius kneeled down and began to pray, asking God, "Lord, God, give us water to quench the thirst of this weakened brother." Then, rising up from his prayer, he dug into the ground 3 times with a piece of wood that happened to be around, and at once a spring of water sprang forth. And having drunk, Sava was strengthened and made well. From that time on, Sava's ability to go on without water in the wilderness improved tremendously. In the year 473 AD, our beloved and pious father Saint Euthemius fell asleep in the Lord, and soon after, Sava decided to leave the wilderness he currently resided in and to move to the wilderness near the monastery of St. Gerasimos of Jordan, which is located near the cliffs of Kedron Gorge, southeast of Jerusalem. Not long after his move, many monks began to gather around him in the hopes of receiving spiritual guidance from him that might lead him into eternal life. And so a hermitage of monks began forming around Sava. This hermitage would go on to become known as the Mar Saba, also known as the Great Lavra. One night, as he was walking around the nearby brook and singing the Psalms of David, he was shown a pillar of fire nearby some ruins, which were located on the west bank of the river, and so the saint continued to pray until dawn. Then, at daybreak, he went to the place where he had seen the pillar, and he found a large and wonderful cave in the shape of a church, which was dug out by the divine hand, and not by a human. And so he adorned the cave, and he made it into a church, and he commanded the brethren to gather together on Saturdays and Sundays. And he, too, dwelt nearby the church. Thus he built his cell on the high rock, and he made a secret door to the church, through which he entered, and he spent the day and night in prayer. Saint Sava went on to found many other monasteries, and he was greatly loved by the Patriarch Sallustius of Jerusalem, who would ordain him into the priestly ranks, and who would later on name Sava as the archimandrite of all the monasteries in Palestine. During those times, the monks at the Mar Saba were faced with a great issue, being that they had almost no access to water, and therefore the conditions were almost uninhabitable. And so the saint decided to pray one night to God, entreating, "O Lord our God, if it is your will for us to live in this place, so that we may glorify your all-lauded name, look upon us, your servants, and spring forth water for us to calm our thirst." And praying so, Sava began to hear the sound of water, and he saw a wild donkey approaching him, and he began to dig at the ground with his hoof. And the donkey bent down his neck, and it began to drink water from the spring, which continued to grow bigger and bigger in size. Thus the monks, together with Blessed Sava, were able to remain at the Mar Saba on account of God's great mercy. Saint Sava worked many such miracles while he was still alive, as he continues to do so until this day. One clear sign of the saint's great love for others is seen through the simple fig tree. When Sava was at the great Lavra, he planted a fig tree. However, while he was gone, the tree dried up and withered away. The monks nearby were saddened by this, and they were planning on removing it. However, the saint told a monk in a dream not to take the fig tree out of the monastery courtyard, as it would turn green again shortly before he returned back home. Thus, when the saint came back to the monastery, the fig tree was green again, and since then it continues to perform countless miracles, especially in God-fearing families which cannot have children. Many families around the world have been granted children through the ceaseless prayers of Saint Sava and his miraculous fig tree, and many have returned to Saint Sava's monastery to thank the Lord for his great mercy. Saint Sava the Sanctified fell asleep in the Lord in the year 532 AD, and he is celebrated by the Orthodox Church on the 5th of December every year.